Okay. Hi, Skipper. Hi, Skipper. Hi. So now on a hot July 25th in 1917, Mata Hari, her name was Margaretha Gertrudia Zell, she was sentenced to death in France for spying on behalf of Germany during World War I. Yeah, so this was Mata Hari. We all know her. She was the woman that really danced and all that. And the history books pretty much say she was a slut. Yeah, that's what the history books say. But the truth is, she was a complicated woman doing the best she could in a world where women were the objects of men, which I believe she used to her advantage, and that was all. You see, she had been born poor in the Netherlands, and being poor anywhere in 1917 sucked. But in the Netherlands, there was one good little thing is that they had still had ownership of Indonesia, and they had people over there. In this case, it was a military guy, and he put an ad in the newspaper that he wanted some hot, young, sweet thing to come and be his wife. And of course, Mata Hari, at the age of 17, she says, "I'll do this. Get me out of this life, this subservient life." And so she goes to Indonesia and marries this guy. And of course, he was an abusive asshole that smoked and drank too much, and the marriage didn't last very long. It ended. There's also a story that they had 2 kids, but the kids died, and of course everybody goes, Marihara, she did that. Well, who knows? Apparently the maid did it. The maid did it back then, not like now, the butlers do it. She ended up going to Paris. She went to Paris. That's where everybody went that had any brains back then, especially if they were a woman or a person of color wanting to have a decent life. They went to Paris, and she went to Paris, and she created the person we know now, Mata Hari, out of using the Indonesian dances she learned. So she actually said she was exotic. She was this person from another world. And so she knew how to, make a living off what was going on that day, back then. So yeah, she took the world by the balls is what she did. And she made a name for herself in a world where stinky, bearded men with alcohol and cigar smoke on their breath wanted a kiss, which she gave them. And the rest is history. Was she a spy? Yes, she was, definitely. She admitted that. But the records of facts show that she was a spy for both sides. And that, my esoteric friends, was her crime. She played both sides against each other for her own benefit, which, if she had been a man, would have made her a hero. Now, on another hot July 25th in 1978, Louise Brown was born. She was the first in vitro fertilized baby ever born. Before her, all the other test tube babies had ended in failure. Something the doctors failed to tell her parents at the time, by the way. But that's another story for another time. Louise grew up normal. That's right. She's now, I think, 43. And she hasn't led anyone into the gates of hell, as the churches back then had warned she would, having a baby like that. But she has led thousands of women to the Netherlands to get their own in vitro fertilization, for Holland has the best success rate in Europe. It is funny that today here in the modern world, in our progressive society, everybody says going to hell. It's funny that the same religious quacks telling women they can't end a pregnancy of a fetus the size of a grain of salt are still against having a baby without a man's thing inside of her. Yeah, they're against a woman having a baby without a man's thing inside of her. That's what I said. And it makes you wonder about their whole argument, doesn't it? I mean, is it really about the life of a baby? Or that thing between a man's legs? That thing, Mata Hari, she knew a thing or two about herself, now didn't she? Speaking of which, on this day in 1984, more currently, Svetlana Savitskaya became the first person to walk in space without a thing between her legs. Yes, the first woman to dangle her thing in outer space without a thing between her legs was a woman astronaut or cosmonaut from Russia. in 1984. That's very interesting. I find that very interesting. Now let's go back a ways, back to 1471, where Thomas A. Kempis, he was a humble monk who quietly spent his life in a German monastery writing the book, The Imitation of Christ, which I will tell you is a pretty good book if you want to read something good. And if all Christians would read it and be more Jesus-like in that book, we probably wouldn't have any wars, or actually we probably wouldn't be too worried about, men's role in society either. But so it was a great pamphlet, and it's still around. It's the second most read Christian thing besides the Bible. And yes, Thomas A. Kempis, he was a humble monk who wrote it. He was so humble that he published it in the Netherlands without his name on it. That's right. It was anonymous. Nobody knew who it was till long after he had died. He wanted no credit for it. He just wanted you to read it. How Christian-like is that? Very Christ-like, man. Yeah. So anyway, why is he being mentioned today? Well, apparently, after he died, a few years later, they opened up his grave, his casket, and he tried to claw his way out. He had come back to life, or he wasn't dead, whichever. What is so funny about that is that in his book, the main thing he hits on is that Jesus was resurrected, came back to life after being put in a tomb. And makes you wonder, a couple things there, man. Esoterically, you wonder, okay, now first of all, was Kempis, did he resurrect and then couldn't get out? Well, that'd be weird, right? Or even if you read Revelations, that all the, it says all the people that believe in Christ, they're going to come back. When he comes back, they're going to come back. And anyway, so was he like the only Christian? I mean, you read his pamphlet, you'd think so, because the guy really, he walked the walk. He said, meditate, be at peace with yourself. Yeah, he was kind of Buddhist. I'll admit that. So anyway, and I'm saying it's a good book. That's what I'm saying here. Go ahead and read it. But anyway, he died, and he tried to claw his way out, but he couldn't. That's crazy. Yeah, because the central theme of his book was how Jesus had risen from the dead. So anyways, was he a good Christian? I don't know. Something to think about. Now, in closing, as stated in Michael Farquhar's book, Bad Days in History, George Washington feared the possibility of being buried alive too. And so on his deathbed, he said, "Do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." Similarly, the composer Frederick Chopin said on his dying bed, "Swear to make them cut me open so that I won't be buried alive." Yeah, being buried alive was a thing back then. Yeah, it was called Taphephobia. Taphephobia. This is why some coffins back then came with air pipes to the surface. Yeah, others had bells that you'd pull from the ground. Say, "Hey, I'm still alive down here, come and get me." And other people asked to be buried with their weapons to finish the job. Yeah, it was pretty much a thing back then, being buried alive. Wow. Now, if that's not esoteric for July 25th, I don't know what is.